Hi, this is Simon for Pidgeon Tools. Today we will be looking at how I made a basic environment like this using Blender and Houdini. Now before we start, this is not a basic introduction to Blender or Houdini. If you haven't used either of the software, please check some basic UI tutorials out. But other than that, we're not really doing anything too crazy. And if you're a Blender user and you have not used Houdini yet, I definitely encourage you to do so. It is very, very intuitive to use it for basic environments like this. It also has a free apprentice version that you can download, and you can also export OBJs from that version. For this tutorial, again, we're using Houdini and Blender, and inside of Blender, I'm scattering my vegetation using Scatter 5.2, which costs quite some money, unfortunately, but there's also free alternatives called G-Scatter, which also comes with a free grass pack. And for the trees, you might want to look for some free resources and use those to scatter it with G-Scatter. That is definitely a very realistic option. You can find enough free resources on the internet. Alright, so I will not be showing you how I would create an environment like this inside of Blender. Theoretically, you could sculpt this, but we want to do inside of Houdini procedurally. And again, even if you're a complete beginner, creating height fields in Houdini is very intuitive. So inside of Houdini, I'm assuming you're kind of familiar with the UI. If you watch this video, like not really, just a little bit, you know kind of the tools and you know your way around the networks and stuff. So let's start by creating a height field, a basic height field, which is kind of just a grid. Again, if you're just familiar using Blender, this is kind of like a plane, and the grid spacing is sort of the subdivision inside of Blender. And yeah, the uniform scale obviously is just the scaling. So I think I'll probably turn down the uniform scale, which is important because Houdini has a feature that simulates erosion on your height fields. I think Blender has a tool like that too, like the A&T landscape has also erosion. And so obviously size is kind of important because if we make our plane too big, the erosion is obviously gonna erode like the appropriate to the actual scaling. So if the plane is too big, the erosion is the environment is gonna look very, very massive. So we want to turn down this, I don't know, to 0.3 maybe or something. We'll see. So this is our base height field. And yeah, so we want to create a noise to have like a basic environment, and then we want to sort of push the area of the river downwards. So if we type in height noise, we can create a height field noise. And if we were using Blender, this is kind of like using the displacement modifier and just throwing on a noise texture, like a, I don't know, we can use a Perlin. These are just noise types. It's really not that complicated. You're just displacing the grid based on a texture, a noise texture. And we can also turn on the amplitude, the strength of our displacement, and we can turn the element size up and down, which inside of Blender would be the noise scale, as you can see here. So let's play with the offset a bit and see if we can get an interesting noise. The offset is kind of like just the offset of it's like just using moving the noise along the three axes. So actually this axis is kind of useless. It's just like moving the noise to the right, to the left, up and down. So we kind of get a different, I guess you could not call it seat, but just a different position on our noise texture. So this looks kind of interesting. You will see if you turn up the uniform scale, it expands. Obviously, because the noise is infinitely generated. So yeah, if you scale this up, kind of can expand this. And I think we could create a nice looking river here. So in order to create this, we are just gonna draw a mask using the height field draw mask node. And as you can see, this is, if you're using Blender, this is kind of for Blender users. If you're familiar using Blender, this is basically the same as the shader node editor. It's the principle is the same. You're just using nodes to create something, and the nodes are pretty self-explanatory. Here we just create a base height field, which is just a grid with subdivisions. Here we create a noise, which is just a displacement node with a noise texture, and the draw mask is just a very, very handy tool to allow us to draw a mask and affect just the mask area. So in order to draw a mask, we just select this tool here, and then we can just start drawing. We can just make a very, very rough shape. Again, I'm not entirely recreating what I've made with my render. I'm just going to show the principles of how I kind of approach this. So basically we created this mask, and now we can sort of output it and use it to do all sorts of things. So if we create a flatten, height field flatten, you can drag this into here. And you can see, oh, we have to always make it visible. You can see we have a blur feature to blur a mask, but this isn't really what we want to do. We want to flatten to value. And now we get another parameter, which is called the height. So if we turn up the height, you can see that it's flattening this area completely based on a certain height, which is 39.1. However, we want to be this in the minus area, so we will maybe do minus 20, maybe a bit more, maybe 29, yeah, maybe even a bit less before. So this is pretty cool now. So we flatten this area, we flatten into the noise, so we also get some height variation. So the river sort of touches the coast very nicely, and then we have like a wall that rises up, and then it touches the coast very nicely like this again. And yeah, so this is kind of it. It's pretty basic. Obviously the noise here doesn't fit very well, so we could go back and we can just play it with the element scale. Maybe even turn on the amplitude. There's really so much you can do. It's pretty procedural. But we'll just leave it like this for now. It's just a matter of tweaking, to be honest. It's really not that hard. It's just finding kind of the right noise and noise settings. Okay, so now we have our riverbed, right? What if we wanted to add a very, very subtle sort of displacement or like bumps to our riverbed? So we just create a hide noise, and we would drag our output here into the basic height field noise input as we've done before. And now we can actually make use of the mask input. And this works by just actually using our mask, which would be this right area, and dragging it into the mask input. And Houdini immediately recognizes what mask to use because we only have one mask, right? You can actually look this up here. We have our mask layer, and if you pick the drop down, we only have one mask. So now basically our noise is only affected on the mask layer. So if we turn on the element size, you can see only our mask is affected. And yeah, you can do some pretty decent stuff with this. It's just very basic, but you can pretty much do anything. And now we have some very basic bumps in our riverbed, and yeah. Okay, now we're going to add the erode. Height field erode is basically just simulating erosion. If you're a Blender user, you might know this feature from the Ant landscape add-on, which is, well, it's a landscape generator, which I think also has the erosion feature. However, I would definitely recommend using Houdini for this because it's just a lot easier to use and a lot quicker. I've tried the Ant landscape add-on and it's just very kind of rough to use. But the add-on is still great. If you don't want to use Houdini, that's fine. I would still recommend it because you can download it for free, use it for free, and it's, again, the height fields. The basics of the outputs are extremely intuitive. And yeah. So now we want to export our geometry into Blender. And as it currently is, we can't really do that because it's still a voxel. So we need to convert it. So in our main geometry network, we're going to create a new geometry node, and we're going to call it terrain convert. Let's jump back into our height field. And here we're going to make a null and use it as our output node. And call it height field out. And then let's go into our terrain convert. Create a object merge node to bring in our height field. So go into height field here and select the out node, and now we have our mesh. And so the next thing we're going to use, we're going to create the node terrain mesh output, which you probably do not have if this is the first time you're using Houdini. This is because you probably do not have labs, side effects labs installed. Side effects labs is sort of like a set of tools, an extension that you can install. If I jump into this terrain node, you can see it's made up of even more nodes. So it's just like another tool made of quite a few nodes that converts my mesh. In order to install side effects, just type in YouTube side effects labs how to install, and it's very, very quick and easy to install. So now we drag our object merge into the terrain converter, and let's view it. This will probably take a bit. Oh, okay, this was pretty quick. And as you can see, it also UV unwraps our mesh actually, which is pretty nice. Let's turn off the ghosting. Yeah, and you can basically do anything. You can set up the density of the mesh. You can also change the tile count. So this is really nice if you mix this up with Substance Painter maybe. You have it already UV unwrapped here, and you can export your high and low and very, very quickly normal bake it in Substance Painter. But this is not part of this tutorial. Yeah, so now we have the converted terrain, and now you're wondering how do we export. So you can only, or as far as I know, you can only export OBJ with the non-commercial apprentice version. So the way I do it is I press right click on my terrain, and I go to save, and I go to geometry, and then I choose OBJ, wherever it is, OBJ, and then you select your file path here. So you basically just save the OBJ, and depending on how high poly this is, of course, it will take some time to export. Yeah, so now we've got this, and then you just import it into Blender. So here's the blend scene. The grass and everything is pretty much turned off because otherwise my viewport would die. And you can immediately see, and what probably most people would point out is that I'm using high poly mesh, which absolutely do not do this. If you have your high poly mesh, and if you actually are using this resolution, definitely do a normal bake. If you do not know what normal baking is, you might want to check that out on YouTube. There's definitely enough tutorials on that. The reason why I did this was because I did not have Substance Painter on me at the time, and I just did not want to bake this using Blender, and I just was kind of too lazy. And I was also kind of curious as to how well Blender would handle this scene, and I'm very, very positively surprised that Blender really manages to handle these high poly scenes now. So this was kind of like a test, and it passed with an A+. So yeah, definitely do not use high poly mesh for just the base, and also as well, especially if you scatter then like this all this grass on top. It's pretty unnecessary. You could also just remesh it, and yes, I'm also even using a subdivision surface. I'm kind of crazy. But yeah, it stood up very well to the test. Like the viewport is very, very smooth. Obviously, if I go into edit mode now, it's going to load quite quite some time. But if we turn off the water, we can see this is our riverbed that we created in Houdini, sort of. And you can see I did some sculpting here because I just wanted to do some manual tweaking, which ended up not being very necessary. So definitely do not sculpt. It's horrible. But yeah, that's kind of it. I imported my mountain. I added my water. I didn't even use a crazy water shader because I was kind of limited. I made this render, like there's a whole project I made in a day, so I didn't want to spend more time on this. So I have a very, very basic water shader. It's not very complicated. It's just a noise texture for the bump and some volume absorption and scattering so that it has some volume. Yeah, so, and yeah, there's enough tutorials on water shaders. So I just imported my mountain and I created a basic sort of plane for my river. And well, you can just choose your appropriate water level. Now I think we could go into the scattering. So using scatter 5.2, which I absolutely recommend as an add-on. This is also not an add-on tutorial, so I expect you to kind of know your way around scatter. So if we turn on our grass, our base grass, you can still see the viewport is working very, very well. So I have my kind of base grass set up. It's really nothing complicated because the add-on does so much for you. Definitely use camera culling and distance culling because into the distance the kind of grass stacks up through the perspective anyways. And yeah, you can see this really stacks up over time. This is really computing intensive, so if you don't have a good computer, you might not want to use so many unnecessary different passes. But you should be able to create this scene with a fairly good computer. Like even if you just use the grass pass, it's kind of good enough. Like this is just grass and some bushes. You should be able to do that. However, if your computer is really not up to the task and it's not able to process this, which is not unreasonable, not everybody has a semi-good computer. The way I would probably do this if I have a bad computer, which I did at some point, I would probably separate the scattering plane into 3 parts. So you have actually if we turn on our scattering thing and turn off our base mountain, you can see this is our scattering object. I would recommend you to sort of split this up so you can control the density even more, because the thing is this plane, and you can't really see a lot of details obviously because it's very far away. Actually, we can open up the render I made. Actually use the blue over. You can't really make out any detail. So for the plane over here, you can make a different scattering plane, and you can decrease the instances per square meter, and you can increase the scale. Because the thing is, if I decrease my instances per square meter, obviously there will be lots of white holes. However, you can sort of make up for that by increasing the scale, which should work, because if it's that far away, you won't really make out that difference. So that's kind of the tip I could give people for that have a bad computer, is that I just sort of make levels of details, and the further back, the less instances, and the bigger the grass. So if you scale up the grass, it covers the same area but with less instances. Yeah, I think that should probably work out. Obviously there's a limit to how well you can use the technique. If you have a really bad computer and you have a massive scene with a lot of grass, that's obviously not gonna work out. Another thing that could probably work is to use this level of detail 1 like use this plane here and actually scatter grass on it, and then maybe try to use a grass texture on the other two. Like use a, I don't know, a free grass texture you can find on the internet, and then just scatter a few grass strands. So it kind of gives the illusion of it being actual grass mesh. But it's difficult because you can see on the render, it's really important that you make out these individual strands and get all these nice shadows. So this is very difficult to make if you have a really bad computer, obviously. These environments are very processing intensive, and there's some optimization you can do, but there's also a limit to what you can do until it looks pretty bad. So yeah, actually maybe I'll make a separate video at some point on how to create optimized, very optimized and environments with some cheap trickery, because at some point we all had a bad computer and we had to make environments, and I also had to mess around with my old projects. But yeah, I'm also scattering stones with a simple quick scatter, and you can see here that I actually manually added grass. The distribution and the manual distribution did not what I wanted to do, so I went in and actually manually put in grass with a certain rotation. I also actually went in and edited the grass to make it more curvy. I used the proportional edit tool to make it sort of curve down. And the reason why I did this is because I had some references, and I really like the way that the grass sort of bends over the ledge. I don't know, it felt very necessary for me to do it. And if you were to say that this looks kind of cloned, like it looks like it is a pattern, I definitely agree. If you look closely, it looks kind of weird. Actually, it sticks out to me very, very, very strongly now. But again, it's a one-day project, so I'm fine with it. But this detail was very, very important for me, and so I just went in and did it manually. You don't have to do everything procedurally. If it's just a still render, do whatever you can to make your render look better. And obviously, if you put in more effort and time to make this look more randomized, it's gonna look not as bad as this. So, and for the trees, I don't think I'll actually show the trees. The trees are visible here. They're just optimized for the viewport. Maybe let's turn off the grass and actually render this, try rendering this. The trees, I didn't really do a lot for the trees, to be honest. There's a lot of automatic scattering that happened. The scattering tool is very, very good. So there isn't a lot of things you have to do besides kind of telling it where to scatter. But the trees it's pretty automatic. I just scattered the trees, sort of fixed the scale and the density, and kind of looked great, to be honest. For the lighting, I'm using a simple sunlight. I'm not using anything fancy. Let me see if I can, yeah, put denoising. I'm using a basic sunlight. You could definitely make a more complex lighting. Scene, I'm not a lighting artist. Lighting artists probably cringe at my scene because I'm just using a sunlight, but again, this was a very quick project. I just wanted to make something very simple. So we have this sort of dawnish color, light that's coming towards us. It's a very basic technique to make things look a bit more interesting, is having the light pointed towards the camera, because it creates interesting shadows, and also it fits very well with this coloring. We could actually make this probably a bit more orange or something. And yeah, I'm using a plane as sort of a, I guess a giant black wrap or like a barn door, to sort of create a shadow here. We'll see if we turn this off. We get this bright spot here, which is kind of distracting because we want to focus on this area here. So that's why I added this. I think it looks very nice. It's kind of like a vignette, but just using shadows, which is very basic as well. And again, if I wanted to make a really interesting render, I would probably have an object here that at least tells some story, maybe like a boat, or maybe like just some interesting looking piece of wood that's maybe floating down the the river and maybe have some really cool ripple textures. There's lots of things you could do here. I added some branches here. The reason why I added them here is kind of the main focus point is kind of this area, and at least I hope it is. And that's why you kind of want to add detail where you think people are gonna look. Obviously you want people to kind of explore your image, but this is sort of the main area here, so I try to add some detail where it's needed. And yeah, this is kind of it, to be honest. It's a very simple scene. It's just pretty high poly, it's pretty computing intensive, but the setup is very simple. So this is kind of it. It's really not complicated. It's a very simple process to make an environment like this. I hope this tutorial could clear up some things. I'm sorry that it isn't very in-depth. It's not very too detailed, because making a detailed tutorial takes a lot of time and effort. But if enough people maybe request a more detailed tutorial, I'm definitely I'm definitely open to make that. So yeah, I wish you best of luck for your environment.